Well, for those of you who were here last night, thank you for coming back again. I think I will disappoint you because there's nothing quite as interesting as Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings. And I'm going to give you a philosophy lesson. It will be a popular philosophy lesson rather than a scholarly philosophy lesson, and it will be inspired by Thomas Aquinas, but it will not be scholarship about Thomas Aquinas. I do not assume that you have read the Summa Theologiae. It's only 4,000 pages long. But my ideas come from Aquinas through a number of other sources, because Aquinas was a great synthesizer. He remembered everything he read, and he read almost everything. They asked him before he died what he would thank God for, and he said, well, the first thing I would thank God for is that I was able to remember and understand every single word I ever read. He had this photographic mind. You have to be really humble to say something apparently that arrogant. And my favorite example of a word that's both very, very humble and very, very, not arrogant, but what should I say, ambitious, is his answer to Christ when, towards the end of his life, having just finished the treatise on the Eucharist, he was in prayer at 3 o'clock in the morning, spread out on the floor of the chapel, and his confessor, Brother Reginald, was spying on him because he testified under oath that he heard the voice of Christ say from the crucifix, "My son Thomas, you have written very well of me. What will you have as your reward?" And Thomas's answer was absolutely perfect. "Only yourself, Lord." Now, that's perfect humility and perfect ambition together. Aquinas inherits something from everybody. He inherits from Socrates his method, the Socratic method of questioning and answering. It's basically the method of the rabbis, too. When Jesus, at the age of 12, stayed in the temple for 3 days, and his poor mother was deprived of his presence for 3 days as a kind of a setup for the 3 days between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And they found him, and he was surprised, and he, like any 12-year-old, he was oblivious to his parents' point of view. "What, you didn't know I had to be in my Father's house?" What was he doing there? And if you look very carefully at the Gospels, he was asking and answering questions. Well, there's nothing better as a way of finding the truth than asking questions. My favorite Jewish joke: why does a rabbi always answer a question with another question? And the answer is, why shouldn't a rabbi answer a question with another question? A Summa article is a systematized Socratic dialogue. It's written by two people, the objector and the replier, who is Aquinas. And the objections are taken very seriously and stated in as forceful and fair a form as possible. And then Aquinas states his answer and defines his terms and gives arguments for his answer and then replies to each of the objections. He gets that from Socrates. He gets from Plato his notion that the reason a thing is good is not simply because God wills it. Rather, God wills it because it's good. In other words, the will of God is an absolute, and the intrinsic reasonability of the good is also an absolute. In other words, the will of God and the mind of God are equally absolute. One of Plato's dialogues, the Euthyphro, tells the story of Socrates on his way to court to be tried and convicted on the charge of impiety and executed because he couldn't honestly profess belief in any of the gods of the state. And Euthyphro is also on his way to court, and his case has also something to do with piety. He is prosecuting his own father for murder because his father found that one of his slaves had murdered a fellow slave, so he bound the slave, and there were no authorities around. It was late at night, so he just left him in a ditch all night, and he died. And Socrates is amazed that Euthyphro thinks it is pious to prosecute his own father for murder, even if, according to the letter of the law, he is guilty of it. And Euthyphro justifies this by saying, well, one of the stories in our religion is that one of the gods did this to his father. I think Zeus did it to Kronos or Uranus or one of them. And Socrates says, you mean that piety is simply doing what the gods will? Yes. And then Socrates says, well, we believe in many gods and they will many things, so the same act would then be both pious and impious. And Euthyphro says, well, at least all the gods would agree that what I do is pious. And Socrates says, oh, how wonderful, I have an expert on piety here. Tell me, is a thing pious because the gods will it, or do they will it because it is pious? And Euthyphro says, oh, it's pious only because they will it. And Socrates says, oh, I don't think so. I think it's the opposite. And the rest of the dialogue is about what's today called voluntarism versus intellectualism. Does the will follow the intellect, or does it just say, I'm the boss, I've got the power, obey me? And that's an issue both for us and for our societies, both the church and the state, and for God. And Aquinas robustly agrees with Socrates rather than Euthyphro. He is not a voluntarist. He does not think that the only reason why we should obey God is that he's the boss. He believes that God is also the logos, that God's always right and always true. So there's something that he deeply is indebted to Plato for. He's indebted to Aristotle for many things. Aristotle is the master of common sense, which is why he's the hardest philosopher to teach to modern students. I find that I give really easy tests on Aristotle, and my students flunk my quizzes on Aristotle more than they flunk my quizzes on any other philosopher, even difficult ones like Hegel or Heidegger. And I'm always astounded at this, that common sense is the least common thing. Anyway, Aristotle, as the master of common sense, has an excellent argument for free will, which Aquinas uses, and I think it's the very best one. And it's the one that C.S. Lewis uses implicitly in Mere Christianity. If there is no such thing as free will, then all moral language, all praising and blaming, all rewarding and punishing, all counseling and all commanding, and the very concept of justice are meaningless. Because when a machine malfunctions, you don't preach to it. When the Coke machine fails to deliver a Coke, you don't say you should go to confession. You kick it. So if you don't believe in free will, then the logical approach to other human beings is to kick them, rather than to argue with them. An example of something that Aquinas inherits from Augustine, by the way, he quotes Augustine more frequently than he quotes Aristotle, and he always saw himself as a disciple of Augustine and tries to synthesize Augustine and Aristotle, is Augustine's crucial distinction between two different kinds of freedom. In Latin, they are liberum arbitrium, which means basically the liberty of being able to arbitrate within yourself and make a free choice between alternatives, and libertas, or liberty, which is freedom from everything that takes away all your freedom, basically freedom from addiction, and the master addiction is to sin. So this lower freedom, free will, is necessary for us to attain the higher freedom, because the supreme good is charity, and charity is free. Unfree charity, unfree love is a contradiction in terms. So God gave us free will, and in a sense, he put himself in the position of being dependent on our free choice, because you can't compel free will, and you have to choose to love. The one thing that God cannot give himself is our love to him. That's what we have to give to God. So Augustine says the whole point of the gift of free will is to attain liberty, positive freedom. Free will is freedom from compulsion, but its ultimate end is something positive for happiness, joy, goodness, excellence, flourishing, that complex thing that the Greeks called eudaimonia, the lasting and deep state of having a good soul. Aquinas also inherits from the Stoics the notion of natural law, the idea of a divine logos, which for the Stoics is usually a kind of impersonal mind, not a personal God, but an eternal mind that knows eternal truths in the moral order, unchangeable basic principles. They made that famous, and that's even implicitly in the Bible. When John begins his gospel with, "In the beginning was the Logos," any Greek philosopher would say, he's a Stoic. Well, on that issue he is, but not on other issues. In today's world, we find many errors about freedom, and Aquinas is an alternative to all of these errors. One is what's called determinism. That's the simple denial of free will, of liberum arbitrium. Matter is not free. Matter doesn't decide, this paper doesn't decide whether it's going to fall or not. Gravity forces it to fall, and therefore it's predictable and controllable. And if you don't believe in free will, you have to believe that everything in the universe, including human beings, is predictable and controllable, although extremely complex. B.F. Skinner, the Harvard psychologist who invented the materialistic and deterministic psychology of behaviorism, argues that if you drop a stone, you can predict and control where it's going to fall. If you drop a piece of paper, it's a little harder to do because of wind shear and other factors, but you can do that too if you know all the factors. And then you come up to something like a living thing, like a forest, and you can pretty well predict how the forest is going to grow, but not with as infallible an accuracy, because plants grow rather more complexly and mysteriously from within. You have to know their DNA, and rocks don't have that. And then when you come to animals, they're even more difficult to predict. Here's the fly on the window, and you want to smack him, and you've got a fly swatter, and you know that if you smack him straight ahead, the fly, since he has a lot of eyes and can see you coming, is going to go either to the left or to the right. So if you smack him right on, you've got a 0% chance of getting him. But if you smack him a little to the left, you've got a 50% chance of getting him. And if you smack him a little to the right, you've got a 50% chance of getting him. But it's only a 50% chance because you can't foretell how that fly is going to move. But nobody thinks flies have free will. They just do it by instincts. Well, here's higher animals, like your dog. How do you know what your dog is going to do the first time, let's say, he hears a thunderstorm? Is he going to be terrified by the lightning thunder, or will he just shrug it off? Well, that's not really predictable because we don't know that many factors. But if we knew everything about the dog's psychology, we could predict and therefore control the dog's behavior. All right, now let's take a little baby whose behavior is rather like a dog's, and in some ways it's less intelligent, in some ways it's more intelligent. Can you predict and control a baby's behavior? Well, not exactly, but there's no sharp line of difference between the baby and the dog. Well, now let's take the difference between the baby and the adult. What's between the two? A teenager? Well, they're totally uncontrollable, but let's not talk about that. Why do you believe that adult human beings have free will and everything else doesn't? That's Skinner's argument for determinism. That's a very popular opinion among sociologists and psychologists. They don't realize its human implications, that we're just extremely complicated machines. But Aquinas is very up to date in having very good arguments that refute that. There's also a kind of higher determinism. This is a lower determinism. Matter determines everything. But you could have a higher determinism in somebody like Hegel or Heidegger, who have a strong sense of fate or necessity, and all of history follows that line, even though we don't know that line, a sort of impersonal God. Or you could have a Calvinist God who predestines everything about you and doesn't accept your free will. So whether the determinism is from below or from above, you don't have free will in either case. Then you have a view that has done enormous harm everywhere in philosophy and theology and politics called voluntarism, which is basically Euthyphro's position, namely that the will doesn't have to listen to the intellect, that the will is the boss, that the will doesn't merely tell the intellect to think or not to think, but it doesn't listen to the intellect. It has its own maps. It's like the captain of a ship who is his own navigator. And that starts with William of Ockham. And Martin Luther was a big advocate of voluntarism. That's another enemy of free will, because if it's all power rather than reason, then there's no authority to the will. Authority doesn't mean might, it means right. Authority means the might that right generates for itself. It's not that right makes might, it's that might makes right. There's a single word in the Chinese language for this. The word is te, T-E. It means moral authority, the authority of a saint, the authority of the good to judge the evil. But we're so non-judgmental that we don't understand that. Another very common modern error about freedom is its politicization, which you get, of course, in Karl Marx and you get in every tyranny and totalitarianism. The extreme opposite of that error would be a kind of pure individualism and pure autonomy. I am responsible only to myself and not to anybody else. And finally, the kind of emotionalism and romanticism that you find in Rousseau, according to whom the feelings are not only the most powerful thing in us, but the most authoritative thing in us, neither the reason nor the will. All of these are errors in many different positions. As Chesterton says somewhere, there are always an infinity of angles at which you can fall and only one angle at which you can stand straight up. And Aquinas has that amazing ability always to find the angle of standing straight up. The only other philosopher in history that is as reliable as Aquinas on that score, I think, is Augustine. He lived in an age of all sorts of heresies, both within and without the church, and like a ship sailing through a place that's full of landmines and garbage, he doesn't bump into any of them. Wonderful instincts. All right, that's my argument for taking Aquinas very seriously. Now, if Aquinas were living today in our culture, what would he say we need to know about freedom? What do we get wrong about freedom? Why are we confused about freedom? I think he'd say that our culture's attitude towards freedom is paradoxical and ironic, because on the one hand, we value freedom enormously, probably more than any society ever before in history did. And yet, the other half of the paradox is that most of us feel deep down that we have less freedom than we had before, less than our founding fathers had. How come if we value something more, we have less of it? There's a parallel paradox about power. I mentioned this last night, I think. Through our spectacular technological successes, we have far more power over nature than any culture ever had before. And yet, most of us feel more and more impotent. As our technology becomes more enormous, we become smaller. We would be less able to survive a catastrophe, like a nuclear winter, than our ancestors would. And among us, the most advanced would least survive, like college professors. Farmers would. 100 years ago, there were 10 times more farmers than college professors. Now there are 10 times more college professors than farmers. We're in deep doo-doo. What explains this paradox? Let's consider a hypothesis, a thought experiment, a possible explanation. Let's suppose that freedom has become our addictive idol. All idols break, and all addictions blind the person who's addicted as the idols are crashing. Maybe we are all Gollum, and freedom is our one ring. It's called the ring of power, after all. It's not called the ring of freedom. But wait a minute. Now I'm going to confuse you even more. Isn't freedom almost identical with power? You have neither freedom nor power if you're very poor, if you're paralyzed, if you're oppressed, if you're enslaved, if you're imprisoned, if you're tyrannized, if you're chained, if you're ignorant, if you're sick, if you're in great pain, if you're dead. How come everybody repeats Lord Acton's famous saying that all power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely? How come nobody says that about freedom? All freedom tends to corrupt and absolute freedom corrupts absolutely. Don't you see that happening all around us? Here, suppose you're rich and famous. Suppose you're the world's famous rock star. You're probably going to die of an overdose before you turn 30. Is that freedom? Might our confusion about freedom come from our addiction to it? Or maybe the causality works both ways. Maybe our addiction to it comes from our confusion about it. In any case, we are certainly confused about freedom. Well, since I am a professional philosopher, that is, an intellectual prostitute, nobody buy my body, so I sell my mind, I will try to sort out the confusion. Boston College is my pimp. It's a good pimp. I think we are confused in at least 4 different ways about freedom. Confused about 4 different distinctions that have to do with freedom. And I will list these distinctions in a certain order, from the most easy to understand because it's quite concrete, to the hardest to understand because it's most abstract. The first is the distinction between the church and the state as visible public institutions, and thus between religious freedom and political freedom. That's pretty easy to see, although they overlap a bit. The second is the distinction between the private and the public sectors of life, and thus between private freedom and public freedom, which has a lot to do with the first one, but it's not quite the same. The third distinction is the distinction between persons and ideas, or between personal subjects and mental objects, between thinkers who are free and thoughts which are not. That seems to be a very obvious distinction, but we'll find that it's much trickier than we think. And finally, the distinction between 3 different kinds of freedom, or levels of freedom, or meanings to the word freedom. The first of these 3 is positive freedom. Freedom for rather than freedom from. Teleological freedom. Purposive freedom. This is what Augustine calls libertas, or liberty. The freedom to attain your end, and therefore your peace, and therefore your happiness. The freedom from failure to attain your natural intrinsic destiny and beatitude and happiness and flourishing and fulfillment and perfection and greatest good. And for Christians, as for Jews and Muslims, this means God. And therefore, the negative aspect of this is freedom from sin, which is anti-God. Second kind of freedom is free will, or free choice. The freedom that Augustine called liberum arbitrium, that's freedom from determinism. And the third is political freedom, which is freedom from tyranny, or oppression, or slavery, whether it's slavery to the state or slavery to private slave owners. 3 meanings of freedom, I think, are quite clear and distinct. So So let me begin with the clearest and most institutionally concrete of my four distinctions, what we today call the separation of church and state as visible institutions, and thus the distinction between political freedom and religious freedom. The idea of the separation of church and state was not widely popular until the 17th century, when it became almost necessary for the survival of Western civilization. Since the more we fought wars with religious passion, the more total the wars became. For nothing merely earthly or merely secular, not even survival, can trump the will of God for a believer as an absolute. The solution of separating church and state was put in place most notably in the Peace of Westphalia in the 17th century, which ended the 30 Years' War, which was a war between Catholic and Protestant states, which was probably the most traumatic and devastating war in our culture's history up until the 20th century. In some parts of Germany, a third of the civilian population was slaughtered. The Peace of Westphalia instituted religious freedom of choice for principalities. And later, that choice was extended to individuals within principalities. And today, nearly everyone agrees that that solution was a good one, and that the politicization of religion was a bad thing. The church goes to bed with the state, she finds that she has gone to bed with a whore. Looking at the consequences of our own past religious wars and at present Islamic wars against both Muslims and non-Muslims, the vast majority today in the West agree that those wars are very bad, both for religion and for politics. Almost all believers agree that the politicization of religion is bad for religion, and almost all unbelievers agree that the religionizing of politics is bad for politics. They have different motives. One wants the church to be free from the state, and the other wants the state to be free from the church, but they both want freedom. So both parties agreed to a separation or a divorce. Good. Once in a while, we do make progress, and we learn from our mistakes. Not often, but sometimes. But a consequence of this agreement has been the confusion between two distinctions. Between the distinction between church and state, on the one hand, and the distinction between the private and the public, on the other hand. As soon as I mentioned that, you probably thought, no, this is the first sentence of Professor Kreeft's talk that I don't quite understand. Wait a minute, private and public sector, okay, that's clear. Church and state, that's clear. What does he mean, a confusion between two confusions? So we have to make a distinction between those two distinctions. Well, by confusing these two distinctions, the separation of church and state has become the separation of private and public and the privatization of religion, the removal of religious voices from the public square. So it's become what Father Newhouse has famously called the naked public square, to such an extent that it is illegal to pray, but not to blaspheme, in public schools. It's illegal to display the Ten Commandments on public land or buildings, even though the Supreme Court ruled that in a building that has the Ten Commandments inscribed on its facade. And one of the most popular rugby stars in Australia has been banned for life, forever, from his favorite sport for the sin of believing in the Bible. He quoted St. Paul, who said something about homosexuality on a tweet, and banned. It's illegal to have religious grounds for public policies, especially policies about America's real religion, which is basically sexual autonomy. It's become hate speech to confess in public that you believe some of the things in the Bible. There was a case in England that really crossed the line. This was about a decade ago. An evangelical Protestant couple who had a lot of foster children, very successfully, and some of them were homosexual and some of them were heterosexual, and they both got along very well. was interviewed by the government, and the government said, you're Christian, do you believe everything in the Bible? Yes. Do you believe that homosexuality is against God's will? Yes. Well, then you can't have foster children. They took the foster children out of their home. Now, the line that crossed is the line between thought and behavior. For the state to control behavior, well, that's necessary to a certain extent. And the only question is, how much behavior should the state control? Should we have capital punishment? Should we legalize marijuana? Those are all questions about how much public behavior should come under the law. That's a different question. Now there's a new category of crimes, thought crimes. You're not allowed to think. You're not allowed to believe something. In many ways, I think England is a more totalitarian state than Saudi Arabia. So not only public behavior, but also private beliefs, at least about this cherished sexual issue, are now becoming illegal. In Canada, I'm told that it is now illegal to say, although probably not yet to believe, but it's illegal to say, and if you say this on a test in school, they'll flunk you, that there are only two genders, male and female. Officially, there are 52 genders in Canada. Haven't kept up with the news, probably 53 or 4 by now. It's illegal to use the word mother or father in public documents. So I think we're no longer moving towards Brave New World, we're in it. This is not the separation of church and state. This is the exact opposite. It is the institutionalization of a real church or anti-church by the state. This is not toleration. This is not pluralism. This is not religious freedom. It's the exact opposite. The intolerance of religious freedom. The freedom of religion has been curtailed by the demand for the freedom from religion. The two parts of the First Amendment have been set against each other, and the no establishment clause is suffocating the free exercise clause. Why has this happened? Well, because the distinction between church and state has been confused with the distinction between the private and the public. This is clearly a fallacy. Religion cannot be confined to the private. Every religion demands certain public behavior. And religion also demands a place for public confession and the right to evangelize. One of the reasons why Christianity and Islam are at war is that both of their founders commanded their disciples to go out and preach and convert people. Well, this confusion between distinction number one, the distinction between church and state, and distinction number two, the distinction between private and public, is based on a third confusion about a third distinction, which is the distinction between ideas and people. That's much more abstract and much more philosophical, but that's the crucial distinction. People who call themselves liberal or progressive tend to treat ideas, at least all ideas outside of science, and especially moral ideas, and especially moral ideas about sex, and also religious ideas connected with them, as purely subjective, and they treat them with skepticism. Subjectivism and skepticism, by the way, are not the same thing. The subjectivist believes that nobody can ever be known to be wrong, and the skeptic says that nobody can ever be known to be right. Both serve the same goal of equality and non-judgmentalism. Progressives are in fact very judgmental towards the judgmentalism of conservatives. Don't you dare to be dogmatic, they say dogmatically. It is true that there is no truth, they said. It is an absolute that there are no absolutes. It's a universal truth that there's no truth that's universal. Truth is not objective, that's an objective truth. But then logic is simply, according to one of my colleagues who used to teach, in all places, at the theology department of Boston College, her name was Mary Daly, logic itself, she wrote, is a conspiracy plotted by dead white European heterosexual pious males to suppress and rape the minds of women. Well, we obviously have self-contradiction here. Do not judge ideas is an idea. Just as the thought that there is no such thought but only matter is not matter, it's a thought. Materialism is an ism. Do not judge ideas as an idea. Do not judge moral ideas as a moral idea. Do not make universal claims as a universal claim. Or as the deconstructionists say, there are no meta-narratives. Well, that's a meta-narrative. But if logic is only what Mary Daly says she is, well, then it's just a Republican plot to suppress Democrats. Or vice versa. I don't think Satan cares whether you worship the donkey or the elephant as long as you don't worship God. Traditional wisdom tells us to be tolerant of people, even very stupid and wicked people, and to be intolerant of ideas, especially stupid ideas and wicked behaviors. It tells us to love sinners much more than we do, and to hate sins much more than we do, in both ourselves and those that we love. In fact, the whole reason for hating sins is supposed to be loving sinners. Just as the whole reason for a surgeon to hate cancer cells is his love for his patient's healthy cells. Christians' three highest authorities all command us to be judgmental. St. Paul tells us, test all things, hold fast only to that which is good. 1 Thessalonians 5:23. St. Peter commands us to be ready to give a reason for the hope that is in you. 1 Peter 3:15. And if we are to give reasons for our hope, well, then we first have to have those reasons. In order to have them, we have to seek them and find them and judge them as being good. So we have to be judgmental. Finally, Christ himself tells us to be tough-minded as well as tender-minded, to have the wisdom of serpents as well as the innocence of doves. Matthew 16:16. But what our current confusion has wrought is the exact reversal of this. Test all things, hold fast to that which is good, has been changed to hold fast only to not holding fast to anything, but do not test that idea. Give a reason for hope has been changed to do not hope for anything from reason outside of the sciences. And be wise as serpents and harmless as doves has been changed to be wise as doves, just cool, and harmless as serpents, that basket of deplorables. Who am I to judge has been transferred from its proper object, namely persons, to its improper objects, namely ideas and actions. So far, this has extended only to things demanded by the sexual revolution. But why? It's inevitable that cancer will spread, that the moral relativism will spread from the sex organs to the other organs, because all the organs of the soul as well as the body are in an organic unity. The third confusion, the one between three kinds of freedom, is really about the relation between freedom and truth. Modernity demands freedom from moral and religious truth rather than freedom for it. Truth has been made relative to freedom rather than freedom relative to truth. It is no longer the truth that will make you free. It is freedom that will make the truth for you. This means that the means and the end, the relative and the absolute, the human and the divine, have exchanged places. Pope St. John Paul II diagnosed this disease long ago in Veritatis Splendor, which is, I think, the second most hated papal encyclical of our time, next to Humanae Vitae. In fact, it was hated precisely because it supported the philosophical principle behind Humanae Vitae. For in order to relativize sexual morality, it's necessary to relativize moral truth in general. But to do that, something positive has to attract the wandering planet away from the sun of truth. What better than freedom? Freedom now trumps truth. That's why we have suddenly embraced not only the obvious insanity of calling the murder of our own unborn children choice and sodomy marriage, but even the right of a man to be and to be treated as a woman simply because he feels like it. After all, at the heart of liberty is the right of each man, not God, to determine the meaning of life and the mystery of existence. Our Supreme Court had said so. And that's the last judgment, right? Well, those are the sacred words of Justice Anthony Kennedy. Freudian slip, sorry. I distinguished three kinds of freedom: political freedom, free will, and teleological freedom. Most people who are not sociologists still believe in free will, and most people believe in political freedom. But the freedom that's the most important one of all is the one that has suffered the most pervasive denial. And that's the freedom to become what we are designed to be and supposed to be and destined to be. Freedom and destiny don't contradict. They're present in every story. A story about robots is not a story. And a story where there's no design has no storyteller, so that's not a story either. So even if philosophers can't coherently explain how freedom and divine design or predestination are compatible, we can see that they are, because every story has both those elements in it. And life is a story, and therefore life has those elements in it. But today, what we are supposed to be is no longer widely believed to be anything much more than what we ourselves suppose ourselves to be. To the modern mind, it is not an objective reality. The finish line is invented by the runners. No longer may we invoke either nature or nature's God as the source of any natural ends. To put it bluntly, we have internalized the motive of the first sin of Satan, who would not serve, only command, who insisted on the ultimate freedom, the freedom to be God, to play God. The ancient Greeks named about 500 gods. The Romans named about 5,000. The Tibetan Buddhists say God has 9 million names, but Americans are the most polytheistic people in history. They have named 350 million gods. All of us have birth certificates. This freedom is neither of the three kinds of freedom I have distinguished. It's a fourth freedom, a false freedom, the freedom to be God. That's the root of our insanity. We demand to be our own authorities because we demand to be the authors of our own identities and our own meaning. But once we can play God, we can play any game at all. We could play the game of Aryan superiority if we wanted to, or transhumanism, or transgenderism, or communism, or consumerism, or sexism, or materialism, or spiritualism, or pantheism, literally anything. Who knows what future fashions will offer? It can be whatever advertisement we fall for. And advertising is the world's oldest profession. It was invented you know where and you know when by you know who. You shall be as gods. How bad can it get? Well, read Brave New World. How long can it last? Fortunately, not long. Insanity is not favored by natural selection. When Eve said her no to God, she became not only less good, but also less human, and less sane, and less real. When Mary reversed the curse with her yes, her fiat, she affirmed and kept and fulfilled not only her virtue, but also her human identity and her true being. Free will means that we can choose to be or not to be, to become more real, that's what heaven is, or less real, that's what hell is. But, you might say, don't we exercise free will even in sinning? Well, yes. So doesn't sin somehow increase that kind of freedom? Because whatever muscle you exercise becomes stronger. No. Why not? Well, we all know from experience that it's just the opposite. Whenever something makes itself a habit, it can become an addiction. Whether it's a good habit or a bad habit, whether it's a virtue or a vice. And this is very clear with regard to physical drugs and to the emotional drug of pornography. It destroys your freedom. So does ignorance. I know nothing. I am totally ignorant about the economics of Nicaragua. Does that mean I'm free? I'm free to believe it's a capitalist economy or a socialist economy or whatever. Does that make me free? Just the opposite. If I went to Nicaragua and I was a businessman, I'd go broke because of a lack of knowledge. Truth makes you free. The truth doesn't compel you. Truth, like love, is an attribute of God, an absolute. And truth, like love, is free. God is not the Godfather who makes you an offer you can't refuse. He's God the Father who makes you an offer you can refuse. That's the only reason hell exists. But if we're still free, we can get out of the little hells we make for ourselves. It's called repentance. In Monopoly, there's a card, get out of jail. The church holds that card in the confessional. Use it. Well, these are an attempt to make some coherent and logical remarks. They were probably a little more random than you would have liked. And I'm going to give myself the hook right now because I'm becoming bored with myself. And I'm going to ask for your questions. And I guarantee that the next 20 minutes or so will be more interesting than the previous ones.
What book of yours would you say most closely encompasses today's topics?
The 4-volume history of philosophy called Socrates' Children that I just finished, it's the 100 greatest philosophers, and especially in modern philosophies, most of them talk about freedom. Freedom's not the only topic or the major topic, but it occurs many, many times. So if you go through those 4 volumes, they're for beginners, they're not that difficult, and pick out everything that the different philosophers say about freedom, you get a pretty good history of Western thought on the subject. If you want a really careful, scholarly, and clear analysis of it, I'd recommend Mortimer Adler's book, The Idea of Freedom. Socrates' Children, 4 volumes, The 100 Greatest Philosophers, published by St. Augustine's Press. It's also a do-it-yourself history of philosophy course, from Solomon to Sartre. Actually, my last philosopher is somebody that as far as I'm aware, is not included in any anthology of great philosophers, and he is unjustly excluded from a philosopher because he never went to the university, but he's one of the most brilliant and commonsensical thinkers who ever lived, G.K. Chesterton. Yes, I clapped for Chesterton too.
Earlier in the talk, in terms of Aristotle, we talked about the meaninglessness of oral language today. I was wondering if you could share with us, early in your career you were a great dialectician, and you teach college students for a living, right? And I'm curious, the talk you gave us today, I think resonated with this audience, but I'm wondering about, and so if this would be like an incommensurable discourse, to use McIntyre's phrase for your college students, what have you found educationally, pedagogically, works for your students who don't necessarily come to you with the same mindset that this audience might?
I think the most important principle here is to realize that all our students are schizophrenic. They're two different personalities. They are, on the one hand, the personality that has been formed by our culture, the ideological cover-up, the persona, the mask. But they're still human beings, and the souls of human beings were not designed at Harvard, they were designed in heaven. So there's a residue of common sense bubbling there under the mud. And you have to talk to both the mask and the real person. You have to be schizophrenic too. And most of us just talk to the mask. Jesus never did that. Notice that in the Gospels, Jesus is always engaging in dialogue, questioning and answering. And he almost never answers a question straight on and direct. He answers the real question. Nicodemus comes to him, lavishes praise on, "Oh, Rabbi, we know that you come from God. No one can do the miracles that you do." He's really asking, are you the Messiah, and are you going to institute the kingdom of heaven, and what is that kingdom, and how do I get into it? Jesus immediately answers the real question. "Truly, truly, I say to you, you must be born again to see the kingdom of God." He's getting underneath. Shall we pay taxes to Caesar or not? They think they've got him. If he says yes, he's a collaborationist and not a good Jew. If he says no, he's a heretic to the Romans and an enemy. Show me a coin. Whose coin is this? Caesar's. Oh, that's the dirty face there? Okay. Give dirty Caesar his dirty money, what belongs to him. Give God what belongs to him. They were trying to cheat both. Should we stone the prostitute or not? If he says yes, what becomes of his morality of love and forgiveness? If he says no, that contradicts moral law, Mosaic law. And the Romans also did not give the Jews the right of capital punishment. So that's anti-Roman as well as anti-Jewish. So what's his answer? Well, they weren't really asking the question honestly. They were asking another question. Who do you think you are anyway? God? What, you have the right to forgive sins? Yep, that's what he does. So he says to them, who are you? Are you her judge? Is this the last judgment? No? Oh, look, you've all gone home. Now, you woman, go and sin no more. He's always doing that. He's always addressing the questioner and not just the question. Now, there's no gimmick for doing that. There's no technique for doing that. But being aware that that's what you're supposed to do and trying to do that and realizing that there's always a deeper person underneath the tongue and the brain, that's essential. But I'm not good at calculating methods and gimmicks.
In the errors you mentioned for, errors in thinking about freedom, if you see those played out in action, they look a lot like Hitler and Stalin. There's no absolute truth. There's no absolute value that a human being has. Mm-hmm. People in America, lots of people, proclaim that as their belief. But those same people would say, if someone acted that out, they would be a lunatic. So my real question is similar to his. It's about education. Are we cultivating ignorance?
Oh, yeah.
On purpose?
Oh, yeah, certainly. Take our sex education courses. The prime result of all this massive sex education has been the greatest possible sexual ignorance. How? Well, what's the first question about sex? What is it? What is its meaning? What is it for? And the answer is, it's for people. It's how you make people. It's about babies. No. According to modern sex education, babies are accidents. That's designed ignorance. Yeah. If you want to read a really, really profound book about freedom in America, read a book written 2 centuries ago by Alex de Tocqueville called Democracy in America. He was a Frenchman who came to America and loved it and gave some prophetic warnings. He said, you Americans are not going to fall for what he calls hard totalitarianism. He foresaw the hard totalitarianism probably because he knew, was he after the French Revolution? I think so, yeah. He knew the terror of the French Revolution, which was a horrible tyranny, and he saw that that could happen anywhere, as it happened in Stalin's Russia and it happened in Hitler's Germany. No, you're not going to fall for hard totalitarianism. You're going to fall for a much more subtle and difficult to identify totalitarianism called soft totalitarianism. And he pointed out that democracy is not an infallible guarantee against totalitarianism because it's an answer to a different question. Democracy is an answer to the question, who has the power or the authority in the state? And the answer is the people. Totalitarianism is an answer to the question, how much power over human life do the public authorities have? And the answer is total power. So there could be a democratic totalitarianism. In fact, Rousseau calls for almost exactly that. According to Rousseau, the general will, the will of the people, is infallible. There's no higher standard. I still remember something that probably you never saw because you're not old enough, the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings. What everybody knows about that is the Anita Hill thing. But before Anita Hill came on the scene, the real drama occurred. The 3 people that were quizzing Clarence Thomas and later quizzing Anita Hill, 2 of them are dead now, Metzenbaum and Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts, and Joe Biden, who's still around, were quizzing Clarence Thomas on his previous writings, in which, following Martin Luther King, he had invoked the natural law to justify the civil rights movement and rebelling against the consequences of slavery. And Thomas naively thought that everybody would be in agreement with that. But these 3 senators, especially Kennedy from Massachusetts, we have a saying in Massachusetts, there's a lot of Kennedy Catholics, but not many Catholic Kennedys. Ted Kennedy was outraged that the judge would invoke natural law. Do you mean there's a law above the will of the people? The law above the Reich? I mean Massachusetts? I mean what we think? He didn't quite say it that way. I was naively scandalized that he was scandalized at such a traditional idea. How dare you invoke natural law? Can't you be a good positivist and say this is just simply the will of the people? It's not reason, it's will. And Thomas was kind of confused about it. And finally he got some backbone and responded. Well, it's become almost illegal to invoke natural law. I'm told that among the law schools in America, there is not a single non-religious law school that teaches natural law, and most of them don't even allow it. And I don't know how this has changed, but I remember reading, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, a poll of teacher training colleges and universities, or programs within universities, which are exclusively devoted to training teachers, that is, elementary and high school teachers. One of the polls was about different moral systems. The first question they asked the students were, do you think that moral values ought to be taught in the classroom? And some of them said no, but most of them said yes. And those that said yes got the next question. Well, here are 5 different systems of moral values that have at different times and places been popular in Western civilization. How many of these would you expose the students to? Because they're at least worth thinking about, and how many would you be favorable to? And if you said, no, I wouldn't even expose the students to them, They were so wicked that you didn't want to corrupt minds by even telling the minds that some people used to believe this sort of thing. And that weren't many of them. And among the 5 moral systems, there was Nazism, communism, humanism, I think socialism, and the natural law theory. The natural law theory got lower grades than Nazism. Nobody would recommend Nazism, but we should study it. We shouldn't even study the natural law theory. That was 89% of the students rated the natural law theory as so destructive, so harmful to our innocent young children that they shouldn't even be exposed to it. That's our future teachers. So that's where we got to fight. There was an Italian Marxist philosopher, Gramsci, who was very clever, unlike most Marxists, and he said, "We communists will never win the world on the battlefield, and we will never win the world in the ballot box. We will win the world in the classroom." He's a prophet. Once upon a time, there were more communists in Russia than in American universities. Now that's been reversed. When I speak that way, please don't think that I'm being bitter or literal. I'm being ironic and provocative, I hope. More questions?
Thank you, Dr. Kreeft. And I just wanted you to comment on, I don't know, what I see as a rare combination of a philosophy professor in a major university who's Catholic and who's happy and joyful and is not suppressed by the current politics.
I know a lot of people like that.
How do you do that? How do you survive? And who are your sources of inspiration, or maybe other colleagues that kind of paved the way for you to be authentically you and authentically an intellectual?
First of all, I learn a lot from my wife. She's Italian and very pragmatic, and we've always had basset hounds who are so sad-looking that we laugh at them. So we see Americans as basset hounds, I guess. I don't know. It's not nearly as hard as you might think. Boston College is not Harvard. It's not even Georgetown. It's Notre Dame. It's significantly Catholic. It's barely Catholic. That's what BC stands for. But it's Catholic enough to feel like home, and it's pretty happy. I'd recommend going to Boston College if you're smart enough to know which teachers and which courses to take. No, I'm pampered. I'm privileged. I'm happy where I'm teaching. I don't feel like I'm on a battlefield, although I have to remind myself that I am.
Dr. Kreeft, I think that the Greeks were determinist or fatalistic, and particularly like in Oedipus Rex, when the prophecies are made. Or do you think that they're really telling us that we have more freedom than we think?
Are you asking about fate and freedom?
You may make that distinction for me. Is Oedipus in that situation free?
Oedipus the king you were talking
Yes.
about. Yes, he's both free and fated. He's a human being and not a robot, and he makes a choice, and they're wrong choices. And psychologically, we all say, how could Sophocles have ignored the fact that the poor man didn't know that this woman was his mother and didn't know that this man was his father, so he's not really guilty because his motives weren't bad. But he still did those horrible deeds. Suppose you shoot an enemy soldier and you realize too late that that's your spy. Your most important spy. You've lost the war. You've done something that's really bad. Your motive is good. You're a good person, but you've done a bad deed. We subjectivists tend to so focus on subjective motives and ignore objective deeds that we reduce all of morality to subjective motive or intention. So Oedipus is a man who is responsible for 2 horrible sins. And necessarily fate or divine justice is going to punish him. And he He is punished. But in the sequel to Oedipus the king, namely Oedipus at Colonus, the gods look down on Oedipus, and they so respect his integrity and his honesty and his suffering that they take him to heaven and make him a god. That's the end of the story.
Thank you.
I have one more simple question. How do we explain as Catholics to our youth that there is no freedom in relativism and the idea that I'm spiritual, it will satisfy?
Well, whenever you deal with an error, there's some truth in that error that's been perverted. So first find the truth. You know, some things are relative, some values are relative. Do you tell the whole truth now, or do you cover up some of it? Well, if you promise to keep a secret, you cover up some of it. You don't tell the Nazis where the Jews are hiding. And it's right to drive on the right in America and drive on the left in England. Yeah, some values are relative, but some aren't. I mean, whether you're English or American, and whether you're in the 20th century or the 10th century, you don't deliberately kill innocent people just because you find them inconvenient. Well, then he's got two categories instead of one. He's got some relative values, which he already believed in. You'll almost always find some people will agree that some things are absolutes. You got to have some absolute. At least you got to be honest. Even if you're a total relativist, even if you say the only absolute is my own conscience, oh, that's an absolute then. Is it ever right for you to deliberately disobey your own conscience? Oh, of course not. Oh, you got an absolute. How come? What's so great about conscience? Isn't conscience just the voice of society? A lot of people believe that. Well, why is society like God? Society is absolute. Society is infallible. Ridiculous. Oh, well, it's the voice of my parents. Well, they're good people, but they make mistakes. They're not God. Oh, well, it's just natural selection. Oh, well, that's just random chance. Why bow down to that? That can be a dangerous argument because it can lead them to a total amoralism. Oh, no reason to believe my conscience. I'll say the hell with my conscience. That's very hard to do. You got to be very wicked to say, I don't give a damn about my own conscience. Idolatry is at least a kind of religion. So find the truth in what they're saying and then help them to see the difference between their truth and the other truth, and maybe they can admit both.
Dr. Kreeft, it's been in the news that a large number of Catholics don't believe in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. Do you see that as trying to free ourselves from what that entails to believe that? I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I think there's two reasons why about half of American Catholics don't believe in the real presence. One is they don't understand it. They've never been taught it. Our catechism has been a disaster for 2 generations. That's changing. Second reason is that that's hard to believe. That's not obvious. That's not like morality. Morality is commonsensical. What God does is not always commonsensical. That thing that looks just like bread and wine, that thing that, if you put it under the microscope, is indistinguishable from ordinary bread and ordinary wine, that's really God incarnate? Wow. Amazing. Oh, that requires such a revolution in thought that it's very convenient to say, well, it's only a symbol. But if it's only a symbol, then Catholics are the stupidest idolaters in history. They're confusing bread and wine with God. So you got to challenge them. They haven't been challenged. They've been comforted. They've been patted on the head. They've been pandered. They've been patronized. Oh, what good little boys and girls we have. You know, be nice. Don't offend anybody. Vote for the right people, and you'll go to heaven. That's not very interesting. I wouldn't want to be in such a church. If that was what I taught, I'd be an ex-Catholic. But this amazing, astonishing story, a story as wild as the Chronicles of Narnia or the Lord of the Rings, that's the Catholic story. And once you get them to see that exciting story, they still might say, well, that's hard to believe. Good, you understand it. Good. I'm much more respectful to an atheist who says that Christianity is the world's craziest fairy tale than to a Christian who says, no, it's just common sense. Doesn't understand it. I don't know any Catholic parish, I've never heard of any Catholic parish that was not revolutionized and transformed by Eucharistic adoration. If that's Jesus himself, he's going to do stuff to you. It's not just you do stuff to yourself. It's not just that you make yourself more virtuous and more pious and whatnot. He does stuff to you. You open the door to him by adoration. And it's a two-way process, and most of it comes from him, through you. That's going to change everything.
So I thought I heard you say that catechesis was changing, the implication being a positive way. And so how would you say the catechism is being used? How is our efforts like the World on Fire Institute, Bishop Barron, people like that who are trying to, if you will, communicate to the U.S. Catholic Church?
I know little or nothing about the business angle of it, who authors and markets the books, but we're getting better books. And once the Catechism of the Catholic Church was out, that did an enormous amount of good. I'd say John Paul II was the greatest man in the 20th century. He's largely responsible for that. God raises up saints when he needs them. So start with the Catechism. Every Protestant that I have ever met who gave a look at the Catechism was surprised and pleased by how Christian and how biblical and how pious it was. They expected witch hunting or something, and they found something utterly reasonable and utterly biblical. So that's a great place to start.
Everybody get a catechism, give it away.
If there's anybody who doesn't have a copy of the Catechism of the Catholic Church in their house, go out and get one.
As one of the few Presbyterians in the room, I have been amazed at how much humor and wisdom has been imparted here at this lunch. I'd like to thank you, because this has been truly illuminating.
Thank you for your thank you. I think we've made more progress in ecumenism in the last 50 years than in the previous 1900.
Well, I have to agree with that. So, we're dismayed when we hear the stories of our Supreme Court and our educators. What can we do other short of joining the Catholic Church to take the good side of the world?
Don't sell yourself short, sir.
Do you have a blog?
Do I have a what?
Blog.
A log, L-O-G?
B-L-O-G.
A blog, no. People use blogs to bloviate. I don't like to bloviate. Or they use Twitter to tweet, I'm not a bird. But I think our Supreme Court is crucial. And the fact that the last two appointees are apparently very good people and will at least hold back the tide is terribly important. And just to speak a private opinion, to my mind, that's worth voting for the idiot and fool that we now have in the White House. It's a good... He's at least doing basically decent stuff.
Dr. Kreeft, so conversations that I've had with folks and trying to take things, speaking to folks who don't come from any sort of religious belief and trying to step into the realm of the philosophical, I've found that stepping into the realm of epistemology is oftentimes the most effective. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about that in terms of epistemology, like the philosophy of like what is knowledge. Insofar as I think that there's also confusion about just what knowledge is, and the notion that that you can have theological knowledge is something that many people see as laughable, right? Seeing only things like science as being sources of knowledge, but not seeing that when you get beneath the scientific method and address those same questions of what is knowledge that can give rise to the scientific method, you're in the same place that can also admit possibilities of theological knowledge and other modes of knowing, including experiential knowledge that people can sink their teeth into. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are related to just epistemology being sort of lost on our culture.
Well, I deeply agree and deeply disagree. here's where I disagree. Philosophy is very abstract. Most people are not that interested in the abstract. Within philosophy, epistemology is probably the most abstract division, and most ordinary people are not that interested in it. So that's not the approach that I would start with. However, you are right in thinking that that's where most of our errors do in fact come from. The idea that knowledge, real knowledge, the only knowledge that we can reliably rely on comes through the scientific method is self-contradictory, because that idea itself doesn't come through the scientific method. The scientific method can't prove itself, can't validate itself. And we all know from personal experience that other forms of knowledge, such as faith, even secular faith, faith in your friends and their promises, or intuition, or simply experience, is sometimes better and much more effective than a lot of merely factual, empirical, or scientific knowledge. So you're right that that's a source of a lot of our confusion, but only if the other person is philosophical enough to realize that and epistemological enough to raise that objection, I think should you focus on it. But it is a necessary focus, you're right. What's crucial here, I think, is not so much arguments, they're necessary too, but seeing. I think the fundamental mistake that starts with Descartes in modern epistemology is the ignoring or denial of what philosophers technically call intentionality. That is, an idea is like a pointing finger. And if I'm pointing to something, there are two different attitudes you can have to my finger. You can look along it, and you can follow its pointing. Oh, some food over there. Or you can look at it. Scientific attitude is always to look at it, to analyze the finger and what it's made of and where it came from. The commonsensical attitude is to say, what does it mean? What is it pointing to? C.S. Lewis has a little essay called Meditation in a Tool Shed, in which he makes that crucial distinction. He locked himself foolishly in a tool shed in the middle of the day, one day, and he had to wait until rescue came. And it was all dark, and all he saw was a tiny little sliver of light where the door, which was locked, didn't quite fit. And then he switched his focus from looking at the light to looking along the light, and he noticed that he could see a road and maybe a person coming to rescue him way down that road. And he said, oh, we can look at anything in those two different ways. We can look at it scientifically and study it from outside, or we can identify with it and look along it and follow its directions. And all the most important things in life, love and family and religion and art, require not just looking at a thing, but looking along it. I remember I had two dogs. They're both dead now. One was a basset hound, and one was a golden retriever. The golden retriever was very smart, and the basset hound was very stupid, but lovable. And when I would point at their food, the golden retriever would immediately follow my pointing and go to the food, but the basset hound would come and sniff my finger. There's a place for finger sniffing, but as the wise Zen Buddhist saying says, a finger is useful for pointing at the moon, but what a fool to mistake the finger for the moon. So that's my agreement with your point about how crucial epistemology is.
Dr. Kreeft, I've recently read Until We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis.
Masterpiece.
And I was curious, are there any authors who are writing now who are writing that kind of stuff?
No.
Any recommendations?
The closest is Michael O'Brien. He has many novels, starting with Father Elijah. He's working on one, which will probably be his last. He's written about 10. They're all good. Some of them are great. Father Elijah, which is about the Antichrist and the end of the world, a much better Catholic version of the kind of thing that Tim LaHaye and Frank Peretti do. Hollywood came to him and offered him big bucks if they could have permission to make a movie out of it. And he said yes, but only if I have veto power over the script, because I know what Hollywood does to good movies. Well, they gave him a script and it was so horrible that he said no. I don't know what they offered him. It was like $250,000. It was a fortune. And he's got a big family and he's not that rich, but he said, no, I can't do that. So they liked it so much that they sent it to another batch of script writers. And he came back with a second script, and it was worse than the first. He did, Hollywood did to Father Elijah what Hilary Mantel did to A Man for All Seasons. Imagine A Man for All Seasons in which Thomas More is the villain and Cromwell is the hero. That is her revision of history, and it's enormously popular. And that's what they did to Father Elijah. So he said, no, it'll never be a movie. But the book is worth reading. Strangers and Sojourners is a great book about family and intergenerational conflict. There's a long science fiction story called Voyage to Alpha Centauri. All of his novels are very good, highly recommended. If you like character-driven novels with ordinary plots but very realistically drawn characters, I would recommend the novels of John Hassler, Hassler. He's a Minnesotan novelist. North of Hope is the best priest novel I've ever read. It's about a good priest. Simon's Night is the best novel I've ever read about old age. So I'd say Michael O'Brien, John Hassler, but they're not C.S. Lewis. And they're not Tolkien, and they're not even Chesterton. There will be great novelists in the future. Every century produces them. But we're in a fallow period right now. I wrote a novel myself. It's not a great novel, but it's a fun novel. It's called An Ocean Full of Angels. And it's to toot my own horn here, it's a God's eye view of the connection between Jesus Christ, dead Vikings, Mohammed, mad Russian prophets, post-abortion trauma, the rights of the handicapped, the crisis of Catholic education, and the end of the world. And a few other things.
I think everybody has a chance before I ask the second question. Thank you for your first answer. I have a very practical question. It's always interesting to hear how you're so productive. I wonder if you could just tell us about, obviously this varies on personality, but what's your approach between your teaching, your writing, how do you use your time, how do you plan and organize your material? Help us understand how you process and produce your work for all of us who in our own little ways are trying to be fruitful.
For two reasons, I'm not going to answer your question. Reason number one is that I don't know the answer. I have no schedule. I just write whenever I can. And I've got no method, so I don't have anything like a satisfying answer to your question. And secondly, I would much rather end on a really good question. So I want to give somebody else a chance to ask the last question. I think the most important things in life are the things where method is the least important. It's terribly important to have a method of fixing your computer or your car. What's the method of loving? What's the art of loving? How do you love? How do you pray? How do you cultivate honesty? You just do it. Method is a way of making something difficult easy. To light a room at night is difficult if you had to rub sticks together like Boy Scouts and gather wood and worry about things catching fire. That's difficult. And electricity and electrical systems make it easier. All you have to do is push a button. Well, that's fine in the material world. But in the spiritual world, technology is extremely unimportant. Not many things you can do by pressing enter buttons. You just do it with your heart, with your will.
Doctor, you have given us a lot to think about today, but going forward, what would you say would be helpful to build on what you said today? You know, at the end of Mass, the priest says, go forth, take what you have. And you spoke about yours. You spoke about Thomas
I thank the Lord for inspiring me to refuse to answer your question so that I could get to yours. I was speaking to some monks in a monastery in Connecticut some months ago, and I don't know what I was talking about, but they were very wise and holy and pious, and I was impressed by them. And at the end, the abbot said, now, Professor, we're going to ask you to do something we ask all our speakers to do. Obviously, we're going to pray for each other. But if God came to you and said, I will give to these monks any one gift that you ask me to give them, what gift would you ask? What grace would you ask God to give us? And I said to myself, that's one of the best questions I have ever been asked. So I can't think and calculate about this. I've just got to blurt out the first thing that comes to my mind. So I said, I would ask for the gift of every one of you falling totally in love with Jesus Christ for every second for the rest of your lives. And they all started to laugh gently, and I knew they weren't laughing at me. And the abbot explained, the reason we're laughing is that Mother Teresa was here last month, and exactly that was her answer.